Hey, hope you're doing well. Andy here from Drive Steady, and today I'm reviewing this, a Porsche Taycan, the base rear-wheel drive version of this all-electric sports sedan from Porsche. So throughout this review, I'll be covering the interior, the exterior, all of the battery-related stuff like range and charging, and finally, and probably most importantly, answering the question, is the base level of the Taycan all you really need? So we're going to find out in this review of the Porsche Taycan. Alright, so let's start the review off by giving a big thank you to Porsche of downtown LA for giving me access to this Taycan today. If you happen to be interested in this car or any other new or pre-owned Porsche product, leave me a comment down below or send me a message on Instagram at DriveSteady and I'll make sure you get taken care of. Now, before getting started with the review, a precursor, I have already done an in-depth review of the Taycan 4S, the trim level above the base rear-wheel drive version. I'll link that in the description below, but this video is mainly going to be comparing this rear-wheel drive, all of its specs, to that upper trim level and trying to answer that question, is this one really the one you want to get? So, starting off with pricing. So the Taycan rear-wheel drive starts at a base price of $86,700, which is almost $20,000 less than that 4S trim level right above it. So what does that really get you? And let's start off by looking at some of the differences on the exterior. Are there really many? Not really. On the 4S, you get PDLS plus headlights. In this one, they're just the base looking headlights. And then you got different looking wheels, but they're both 19 inches. So base for base, the rear wheel drive and the 4S practically look the same, sans for the wheels. Otherwise, the rear wheel drive is just as awesome looking as any of the other Taycan trim levels. Alright, so now let's switch gears and talk about the real meat of the differences related to the battery and the motors, which will eventually translate into horsepower, torque, and acceleration. So, the motors in the rear-wheel drive trim level, there's only one and it resides on the rear axles, as opposed to in the 4S, there's two motors, there's one in the front and one in the rear. The batteries are the same capacity, 79 kilowatts and 93 in both trim levels. If you opt for the 79 kilowatt an hour battery in this rear wheel drive trim level, 321 horsepower, 254 pounds-feet of torque. And if you decide to go with the overboost function and launch control, 402 horsepower for a short period of time. Now, the 93 kilowatt an hour battery does get you a power bump just like it gets you in the 4S. So in the rear wheel drive trim level, bumps you up to 375 horsepower and 263 pounds-feet of torque. And if you use the overboost function, 469. So what are the differences in horsepower and torque? 79 kilowatt an hour battery, 4S gets 108 more horsepower and 218 pounds-feet of torque. Now, I'm not going to compare the overboost and launch control functions because you're not going to drive around all day with the launch control enabled. So you do get a significant amount of more horsepower in the 4S, and when you switch over into the 93 kilowatt an hour battery, things don't really change. 107 more horsepower there and 299 pounds-feet of torque over the rear wheel drive. So the money that you're going to be paying, that extra $20,000, is mostly going towards the additional performance or horsepower figures that you're going to be getting in the 4S. So got that? Now let's stay on the rear wheel drive and talk about some of its specs. The transmission, you've only got one. It's a 2-speed in the rear compared to the 4S. It's got 2 transmissions, one for each motor. Now, one additional benefit of the Taycan rear-wheel drive is the fact that it weighs almost 200 pounds less because it doesn't have that front motor. And all of this translates to a 0 to 60 time of 5.1 seconds. Now, this number doesn't change whether you go with the 79 kilowatt an hour battery or the 93 kilowatt an hour battery. And comparing this number to the Taycan 4S, 3.8 seconds. So, as I mentioned, the additional $20,000 you're going to pay to jump to the 4S is mainly going towards the speed, the acceleration, the horsepower, and of course all-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive. All right, so now let's talk about range and charging. And the base rear-wheel drive Taycan with the smaller 79 kilowatt-hour battery gets a range of 200 miles on a full charge. The bigger battery pack, 225. Now this is according to EPA's testing. So Porsche hired their own independent third party and were able to beat the EPA's numbers. So with the base rear-wheel drive smaller battery, 252 miles of range. In the bigger battery, 282. And this is very similar to what independent magazines and other car reviewers have tested the battery range of the Taycan, pretty much crushing everything that the EPA has published about its range. Now, comparing this to the 4S, the rear-wheel drive actually gets better range than the 4S does. It's probably because it's a little heavier and the batteries are juicier. So comparing this to a higher horsepower car, cars with more horsepower usually get worse fuel economy, and it's no different in the electric version of the Taycan. And as far as charging goes, you have two charging ports in the Taycan. So you've got one on the passenger side, which is a DC fast charger enabled port, and then the one on the driver's side is actually just a regular AC slow charging port. So keep that in mind when you're pulling into your local DC fast charger. Passenger side is where you want to be if you're DC fast charging. As far as charging time goes, if you're getting a higher output DC fast charger, it'll take 22.5 minutes to go from 5% to 80%. If you're using just a regular 50 kilowatt-hour charger, 93 minutes from 5 to 80%. And then if you're deciding to AC charge something at home or something at a slower pace, that'll take 9.5 hours to go from 0 to 100%. All right, now let's talk about some of the suspension, wheel, and tire differences with the rear-wheel drive. So in this trim level, you do get the same 4D architecture and PASM, but the difference is that you ride on a fixed spring suspension. So in the 4S, you have a adaptive air ride suspension that has the ability to raise and lower itself, but here's the bonus. You can actually option that into your rear-wheel drive trim level for $2,200. So if that's something important to you, just tick the box and the difference will only be $18,000. Now, let's talk about some of the other differences. So with the wheels, as I mentioned, the design is the only difference as far as size. They're both 19 inches. You do have options. They're basically the same. This one is equipped with one of those options. They're the 20-inch wheels. They have a really cool black and silver trim to offset some of the black exterior paint. So it's a really nice option, at least in my opinion, for this trim level. Now, the tires are the same, completely identical size. Now, inside the wheelbarrow, the brakes, they're basically the same mechanically. The only difference is that the 4S has red calipers and this regular rear-wheel drive has black calipers. All right, so now the interior of the base Taycan, and I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here, just the highlight items, because I did the full in-depth review on the 4S. If you're interested, go watch that. But a lot of the functions and overall interaction, the size of the interior dimensions are the same, whether you go 4S or base rear-wheel drive. So let's go over some of the highlights. First things first, this has the standard interior compared to in the 4S, it had the full leather interior, and this is perfectly fine. It doesn't look any less luxurious. It still looks very nice. The materials still look really good. So in my opinion, you're not really losing much going with the standard interior compared to the full leather. Now, the leather itself, this is called limestone beige, and I absolutely love it. It provides a great breakdown or contrast with the dark color paint and a lighter interior. And another thing I like about it is that even though it's beige, it's not like a creamy white beige. It's like a darker color. And this car with almost 4,000 miles on it has held up very, very nicely. Now the seat. Here's another difference. This has the standard 8-way seat compared to the 14-way seat, and the 8-way seat is just as comfortable. The area where it's a little different or lacking compared to the 14-way seat is aggression. It does not have any bolsters, but I think it's totally suitable for daily driving, and that's probably where you're going to use this thing most frequently. Now, some of the other things, the technology, really quickly, you have the wonderful 16-inch widescreen here. You have almost 11 inches of infotainment and a separate screen for the climate control items and your heated and ventilated seats and all that wonderful stuff. All I can say really quickly is I really like the technology in the Taycan, especially for the 2022 model year and above. They added wireless Android Auto. So you now have wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. So that's fantastic. And the overall interaction and the simplicity that the new PCM has for 2022 and above is fantastic. And as far as storage space goes on the interior, it's identical to the 4S. I didn't cover the frunk and the trunk in detail, but know that they're the same. They're identical as far as cargo space in either trim level. So you're not really losing much as far as storage space, and the charging is also the same. You have a wireless charger and 2 USB Type-C outlets in the front. Let's go to the rear really quickly. I'll give you some highlights there, and then we'll go to the driving portion of the review. All right, so now the back seat of the Taycan. Very quickly, let's talk about the overall size. It's not the largest back seat in an EV car, but I would say it's adequate. So sitting behind myself at 5'11", you can see I have some legroom here as far as headroom goes. Not the best. My hair is touching the upper portion right here where the material touches the glass roof. But overall, okay. And you do have heated seats back here as well. The one thing this is missing is it doesn't have the 4-zone climate control, which you can still option into the rear wheel drive. So again, you're not really losing much in the base back seat. Of course, as I mentioned, it's the same interior dimensions, and all the other stuff that would come as standard in the 4S, you can also option in to the rear wheel drive or the base trim level. So with all that out of the way, now let's go to the driving portion of the review and see what this thing feels like behind the wheel. All right, so now the driving portion of the Taycan, and the key is the same key, nothing really special about it. This is not color matched or anything like that, so just a normal Porsche key that you get in basically every other car. So let's go ahead and take this thing for a quick drive, and let's see if we can identify some of the differences with this driving or the driving dynamics of this compared to the 4S that I drove a little bit ago actually. So the shifter is up here on the column, and let's see, well, not on the column, it's actually here on the dash. Let's go this way. It's a better route, and I'm currently in normal for all the settings. The drive mode is in normal, the chassis is in normal, and this is actually a sublime car to drive in these modes. It is so smooth and so comfortable. It soaks up all of the bumps really nicely, and I would imagine that this thing would be so nice to drive on a daily basis. Now, I'll touch on that a little bit more, so I'm going to go back into sport, and let's see what this thing's got with respect to acceleration. So going 20 and foot to the floor now. Okay, it's definitely got some get up. Not a slow car by any means, by any stretch of the imagination is this slow. Now I'm moving a little bit faster, and let's see. Okay, the acceleration from a higher speed is also very, very good. So one of the interesting things, I wasn't able to do it at during that acceleration, but when it's in second, the transmission that is, and you just mash it, it's interesting to feel it downshift, and it feels kind of odd in an electric car. Now let's see if we can get some more acceleration here, and I want to do it from a stop, because from a roll, it's definitely quick enough. It's not as fast as the 4S, but it's definitely quick. Let's see. Stop. Mash. Okay. It moves, guys. This thing totally moves. Again, compared to the 4S. Is it slower than the 4S? Yes, I think you know the obvious answer. Does it feel slower? Is it noticeably slower? Yes, it is noticeably slower. And that's not a bad thing, or it's to downplay this car, because the 4S is extremely fast. That gives you a really big shove into your seat when you mash the gas pedal or the accelerator pedal. There's no gas in that one. But this, do not be fooled by that 5.1 second 0 to 60 time. This is plenty quick enough for a daily driver, or even to get your blood flowing a little bit. This is plenty fast enough. And remember, Porsche 0 to 60 times are always underrated. And the additional, I guess, angle you can look at it is, this is an EV car. If it was a gas-powered car at 321 horsepower with this much weight, you might say, oh yeah, it feels kind of sluggish and slow. But the difference with the EV cars is the torque from zero and the thrust that you get when you mash the gas pedal. I said it again, the accelerator pedal. So it really gives you a good sensation of speed in real life day-to-day driving, from a stop, when you're passing somebody, entering the highway. So there's plenty of speed in this. Now let's talk about the overall sportiness. This still feels properly sporty, even though it doesn't have the PDCC and some of the other trick suspension stuff that it had in the 4S. But when I put it in the sport mode and then the chassis in the sport or sport plus, it does get properly stiff, but still obviously just fine to drive on a daily basis. But there is definitely a sporty feeling of this. Remember, it's still a Taycan, and even as a base model, this thing is advertised as a sports sedan or a sportier EV compared to other EVs. So what about it on a daily basis? As I mentioned earlier, it's very comfortable. The seat is nice and cushiony. The overall experience, one of the things that's always undervalued is the Porsche interior and the overall experience of driving a Porsche. And what I mean by that is how everything ties together. The overall interior space, the technology, the ergonomics, the functionality of how things work is just almost perfectly executed, and it's almost a joy and very satisfying to experience this car from behind the steering wheel, beyond just the driving dynamics. So the magic question, is this good enough? And good enough is always a relative term and subjective. So what I'm going to do is tie it to daily driving, going to work, going to pick up your kids, dropping off your kids, going to pick up groceries, going to nice dinners. So looking at it through that lens, is the base model good enough versus the next level up, the 4S? And I think that is a resounding yes. It is absolutely good enough. It is more than adequate in those scenarios that I just described. It is properly quick. Don't look at the 5.1 seconds 0 to 60 time. Again, it feels faster than that because it's an EV car. It's still got the Porsche sportiness, and the overall interior space is the same. The partial leather interior, or the base interior, is really nice. The technology is the same. The interior space, the dimensions, everything is the same compared to the 4S. And for the things that aren't the same, you can just take away from that money you're going to save compared to the 4S and option those things in. Things like the leather interior or the air suspension. So those things you can just plug them into the base model and call it a day. Now, if you need the extra power, if you've got reasons for it, or if you need the all-wheel drive, then by all means, get the 4S, because those things cannot be optioned into this car. But those other things, they certainly can. And I think for those reasons, and for the fact that this still feels plenty fast enough, I think this is more than enough for the Taycan experience, tied to some of those daily situations that I was talking about. So that's pretty much it. If you've got any questions, please leave me a comment down below or send me a message on Instagram at DriveSteady. Otherwise, thank you for watching this video. Until next time, drive steady.